afternoon, folks. I would like to welcome you today to our online info session for the Certificate in UX Design program at Ashton College. My name is Adam, and I am from the Marketing and Communications team. We have Daniel here today, who is part of the UXD faculty at Ashton College, and he will be answering questions from UX design and its career path. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Adam, thank you so much as well. Really appreciate being here.
Yeah. All right, can't wait to get started. We also have Demi, who's in programs and administration, working back-end, monitoring our online chat. But first, there are lots of ways to engage with us during the session, and we love hearing your questions. On Zoom, you can use the chat box, the question and answer box, or the raise hand function if you're tuning in on Facebook Live. You can leave us a comment and we'll be able to answer your questions live during the session. If you're watching this video on YouTube, you can leave us a comment or give us a call at 604-899-0803 or our toll-free number 1-866-759-6006. Now, on to our interview portion. Daniel, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Now, let's get on with the questions. Could you start by sharing with us what is UX design?
For sure. That's a great question and a good starting point. So UX design is basically the user experience design portion of applications, websites, or programs as well. So if you're thinking about it from those kind of terms, you're thinking basically any single time you interact with an app on your phone, whether it's a music app, a game, a working product activity kind of thing, those are all, you're all interacting basically with UX, how you move from one screen to the next, where the buttons are located, what happens when you click something, whether you're on a website, you're using something like Facebook or using Spotify, any interaction that you're basically doing with it is effectively the user experience. So that's how it makes you feel. It's basically not so much do I feel good or do I feel bad, but it's more about, does it get the job done? Obviously, depending on what it is, if it's just a consumer thing, it's just something for fun, recreation, you're going to have a different experience than something that's, meant for work, for example. So in a nutshell, that's basically what UX is. It does stand for user experience. And yeah, that's basically it.
Right. Yeah. I think I feel like a lot of companies forego the feeling part. So I'm glad that you're here with us to describe that, how important this part is in wanting to, let's say, make their business run properly or just anything in general. Right. So what made you want to get into this field? How did you get started?
That's a really good question, because my career path has not been what I would call a typical career path. And what I mean by that is I didn't go to, graphic design school and then take a 2-year program and get a diploma and then go out and become a graphic designer and then transition into UI or UX. That's what a lot of people tend to do. What I actually did was, my career path started in animation. I am still very much a passionate animator. I really love animation and cartoons and comics and all that kind of stuff. And when I was growing up, that's what I wanted to become. So I went to school, I learned that. I actually graduated. I worked in that field for a number of years doing different roles. And then around the time that the iPhone and Android became a big part of the world and just becoming a more daily thing, this was around, I want to say 2010, 2011, I realized that, well, I love animation. It's not really my career path. It's not really what I want to do for a living anymore. I still enjoy it as a hobby. I can definitely appreciate it, but that's not really what I want to do. So I had the ability I could draw and illustrate really well. I do want to highlight this, though, that's not an important skill to necessarily have. You do not need to be a good illustrator or designer in the sense of actual drawing ability to become a good UX or UI designer. That's not really that important. But I had those skills, and at the time they were really valuable because I was working on a lot of actually mobile games and sort of mobile education and mobile health kind of style games. So my illustration skills came in handy because I learned how to design custom buttons and custom characters and backgrounds and pieces. And it kind of learned how to make games this way. And this was way back in the day when it wasn't as streamlined as it is now. And that kind of snowballed my career. I started in one studio, worked on a game, with a health company called Sanofi, which is a big one in the UK and parts of America. And basically from there, that kind of snowballed into other studios that then saw that I could do this kind of work. Everyone got very busy. This was the time mobile games were exploding. Lots of games are coming out. I ended up working for different companies, again, reusing that skill set. I had animation background skills, so I knew things like timing and motion. So a lot of those skills ended up coming handy because I could put them together and do other parts of games that really came in handy. And basically that led me to kind of becoming more of like an art lead or not, I don't want to say a director, but a little bit underneath a director where I'm overseeing art styles and I'm overseeing other team members. And, multiple years in, that really helped out a lot. And I kept kind of going with this. And then at one point, I basically decided for myself that while games are really fun, that's not really maybe where I want to be for the rest of my life either. And the UX field is quite wide. It's very diverse. There's a lot of different avenues and areas you can really approach and get into. So you're not limited to staying in games. You don't have to be in technology. You can kind of, transition between fields. And at first it was a little bit difficult, but I eventually got my foot in the door and I started to work for larger companies doing actual products. I started to work for, payroll companies doing finances. I did more educational stuff. I did some more sort of startup work as well. And all this really led me to continue going down my path. And the reason that really attracted me was because I really like problem solving. I like dealing with people's issues. I like trying to make experiences for people easier, simple, more intuitive. As a lot of people can probably attest, especially with, aging parents or relatives in their family, you can see firsthand sometimes how frustrating it can be for them to use technology if they're not really used to it, like tablets and computers and phones. Seeing them kind of struggle with it made me realize like how much empathy you really need to have when we're designing these things. And a lot of services are not geared towards them. It's geared towards, being young and being hip and being cool. But really for me, it was a big factor of like, how do I make a lot of people really happy and how do I make them feel really good in a lot of different ways? So that's why I say my career path hasn't been the norm, but I'm very grateful for the experiences I've had because I think everything together has really put everything in a way that I could really expand and I could use all my skills in different parts of my career. It wasn't just limited to any one time. So for anyone out there who's interested in thinking, hey, I'm doing XYZ job and now I want to do this job, can I jump into it? I would say to you, yes, because really, even if you do things like retail or if you're doing like whatever, and that's your career now, you still have skills that will then help you in the UX field. You still need to know how to talk to people. You still need to know how to manage yourself. You need time management. You need to know how to think creatively and critically as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different areas and avenues as well. So I'll be happy to discuss that as part of this session.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Now I'm curious that did you ever come back to get some formal education for UX specifically, or is just purely the amount of things that you did in animation and just straight up just the user experience? Like did you manage to?
Yeah, another great point. So like I said, I first went to animation school, learned a lot about, drawing and anatomy and motion and space and timing and all that, all the film stuff, which I still love to this day. And then when I worked in the field, it didn't really, none of those skills really transfer into UX or UI specifically. Maybe some of the art, like just understanding color theory and understanding color history and color meaning and some stuff like that. But in every other sense of the way, it really didn't. What really helped me was the fact that I myself was actually into that. I actually liked print media, like I like magazines. I always read magazines of different kinds, whether it's fashion or just art like graffiti or skateboarding or whatever. All this stuff kind of wrapped around, and this stuff really interested me as well. So when I went back to school, I learned 3D, but I also learned more art design, a little bit more around typography. It wasn't formal, but it was enough just to kind of help me out a little bit more. And really, I have to say, probably the bulk of what I learned was actually on the job, which is true for most cases. School is an incredibly helpful, useful thing, but I think a lot of people think that's also where the only place they can be is like, I just have to go to school. You do, but for some people as well, you will learn a lot more on the job. So if there's that feeling of imposter syndrome when you graduate and you're like, well, I'm done this program or I'm done this course, I'm not ready, you will learn a lot more on the job and you will learn very quickly like the things you need to do. And each place does it differently. So I feel like school is a great, fantastic place to experiment and be very diverse. really try everything out. And then when you go to the job, you won't have that opportunity again. So really cherish what you have in school, because that's the time you get to truly be creative and truly try things out. Later on the job, you'll have to do it the way they tell you or the way they want it. So you won't have those abilities anymore. So I think that's also a critical part of it.
Well, thank you for that. And it's good that you mentioned that, because not everyone's going to shift in the middle of their career change, but it's good to know that they could grab a lot of their transferable skills and like correctly apply it to user experience. And then for those who are new, they could come to our UX design course, which they could actually get their hands on. And as you said, to test out what they can do, and of course experiment with different types of tools. And because of that, how do you think this program will be beneficial for students, and what do you think students will enjoy or appreciate the most about this program?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in my perspective, at least when I teach these kind of courses and these programs, I try to be very open about it. Like I said, it's not just, okay, I work in tech now and I do more, product level service work, which is, more programmatic stuff. So if you're thinking of like, Microsoft Word or Excel, like I might be working on something like that now, but the field is very, 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 very big. If you really think about it, even here locally in BC and Vancouver, we have a huge industry that like deals with a massive amount of different things. There's UX needs for medical services in terms of medical imaging, patient recording. There's a lot of diverse companies coming here. So I think at this time, people looking to get into this career field is a really good way. Number one, it's booming. Number two, it's very busy. Yes, there's ebbs and flows. Yes, the industry might slow down a little bit, but at the same time, the need and the demand will only increase as time goes on. So I think people looking for that entry point, they're looking for a job that pays relatively well for what it is. It does make use of your skills. It is a thinking person's job. It is not the kind where you just sit back and you click a couple buttons and magically things are done for you. You do have to actually do a lot of thought work. It is a lot of research, a lot of referencing. But I think people coming into the program will find that they will learn a lot about even the things that they use that they might not know of, that they might have taken for granted, or they just kind of did a quick look at and say, oh, I didn't really think about it that way. I think that's the one thing, is you also see that. I think generally the UX methodology, the way you think about it, actually helps you in life, because it makes you look at things from different angles. You're not just focused on the one thing in front of you. You actually have to look at it from different sides, because a big part of being a designer is being empathetic. So you really have to think about someone else's perspective. It's not designing something for myself and how I would like to do it. It's about how would somebody else do it. I have to think, how would this person who might not be very tech savvy approach this thing? What might be the thing that they're looking to do? Understanding the needs, the wants, the desires, those kind of things up front are more important. So I feel like this kind of a program will help kind of, even if you don't get into it, or you think you might, I think you'll still walk away from it understanding a little bit better, number one, of human psychology. I think number two, you'll understand technology elements a lot better. And number three, I think you'll understand how those kind of connect with the world and where the world's going now, like where tech is heading to in the next, 5 or 10 years.
Wow, it's actually really good to know that students will be able to, you know, enjoy and appreciate these many things, and and empathy. That's actually quite I guess a nice skill that people should have. I mean, of course. um, so, and I think that all the students here, would like to know, what is your teaching style like?
My teaching style is pretty casual. I'm not like a stuffy professor type. I'm actually I mean, being an animator and an artist in the beginning, like I'm pretty goofy. I'm very animated, so you can't tell on camera I'm sitting here, but like if I'm in person, I'm very animated. I'm literally like a cartoon character. I walk around, I gesture all the time. I'm very, like, my face is very expressive as well. So I'm not a very serious, like stuffy kind of person that way. I like to do a lot of anecdotes. I like to do a lot of examples. And my teaching style is very much in the sense of I try to give a lot of context. So I try to always explain it in a way that I assume the person I'm speaking to has either very little knowledge or doesn't quite know what I'm talking about. So I try to wrap it in metaphors or in other examples that more people would understand around whatever it might be. So I really take my time with that. I try to be very open around answering questions, and I actually enjoy when people ask me things and they say like, hey, what about this? What about that? Because curiosity is great. And I think that's also a good trait to have, especially as a designer. you got to be hungry, you got to be creative, you got to just go after things. So the more people ask me about stuff, that makes me feel really good. And I'm always happy to share stuff back as well.
See, now that is the kind of teacher you would want. Like, I mean, I want to be a teacher in the future, and man, you're kind of like the person that, I want to be, and many people should be as well when I teach something. Now, now asking now to now I want to know from you, what are your expectations of the students who enroll in the program, and how much study time will you like expect the students to like do to be successful each week?
I think the criteria is shouldn't be thinking about it like, hey, you need to do X amount and then it's a magic number. And then if you do 40 hours or whatever, magically you're going to be fine. It's not really about that, actually. It's more about thinking about what it is that we're trying to learn. So, obviously throughout the program, there's going to be a lot of different things we're going to cover. We're going to cover the basics of, what is UX design, then the different principles of UX design, getting to things like typography, getting to things like layout, grid systems, design systems, actual technical backend pieces around, programming languages and how they fit in. It's not too technical. So if people are worried about like having to learn or know like HTML or CSS or any of these other programming languages, we're not getting into that kind of stuff too much. I will touch on how they affect things, but not so much in how to actually do them or really worrying about them. I think the biggest thing is just actually playing around and taking time, like as simple as, if you have a tablet or a phone, opening up apps and actually really critically thinking about how to use them, rethinking about them in a different way and being like, everyone here or most people I imagine on the call have used, a Netflix or a Disney Plus or a Spotify or something like that at one point or another. So, there's always opinions and thoughts around stuff like that. How could this be better? What if you wanted to do this kind of a thing? What would you think? How would you approach that? How would you design that? You're thinking about designing at scale too. What might work for 10 people doesn't work for 100,000 people, stuff like that. So the thinking will evolve as we go along. But in terms of study time and stuff like that, I think it's really up to the student themselves. My expectation is if you're coming in, be hungry, be passionate, ask questions. Those people that do and those that push will be the ones to do well. If you sit there and you just do the bare minimum, that's all you're going to get out of it. You pretty much get in as much as you put in. So if you put in a lot, you get the effort. Even if you feel like you're not the best at it, it does take time. People learn at different levels and different rates. And maybe you find out that that's not really your thing after all, and that's totally fine too. It doesn't have to be, a lot of people start something like I started animation. I thought that's what I was going to be, but I'm not. So that's totally okay that you go down a path and you realize that's not for you. It's better to try and not have it than not try at all and not know. So.
Exactly. Like gotta love curious students, and especially just curious people, because like not only they could start something like a conversation, but then also, they're learning something and probably you might learn something from them too as well. So with that said, what are the career options or typical next steps for students after they graduate from the program?
Yeah, so that's huge. I know a lot of people have that in mind where they're like, oh, can I get a job? Will I get a job? What's going to happen? Money, all that kind of stuff. So right now I can tell you currently, at least in the Canadian market, it's pretty healthy. We have a pretty vibrant ecosystem in terms of jobs and career paths and opportunities. So like I said, within the UX realm, just by itself, you have a lot of opportunities with, proper tech companies. Here in British Columbia, we have a lot of companies that obviously are now moving in here as well. We have a lot of big players, your Microsofts, your Amazons, your Facebooks, Apples, those kind of things. But we also have a lot of mid-sized and smaller companies as well. We have a large amount of game studios. As I mentioned, I think at one point we had like over 60 different studios. I think that number's dwindled a little bit, but there's always new ones starting up. And we've had a long history of that too. So if people are looking into getting into something like gaming or VR or AR, there's definitely a lot of that element happening as well. It's only going to keep growing. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And there's also always freelance opportunities as well. So, I mean, even when I started off, that first year, those first little moments, of course, they're the most difficult because you don't have a lot under your belt and you're always looking for a job and you're going to be like, it'll be a little bit of a struggle, but there are a lot of opportunities out there. And the biggest thing I can say is about matching what you do with what the company's looking for, right? A lot of people just blanket apply and they say, hey, I've done some design, I'm going to apply to 100 places and hopefully one of them writes back. The actual better way of doing that is actually looking at the company and saying, do they even do what I do? And does my work even match what they're doing at all? And if it doesn't, chances are you're probably not going to get hired there. But if you really want to and you really enjoy that type of work that they do, that's a wonderful opportunity to do a portfolio piece or a case study where you directly tailor your work to their needs. And you say, listen, I've taken some time, I've done this, here's some work that reflects what you're doing. I hope that it does that. But there are a lot of opportunities. I only mentioned UX, but there's UI opportunities. So again, if you're into the more visual side and you don't really want to worry about thinking about how to interact with things and how things work, you just want to design things, UI career options are out there as well. Again, a lot of gaming elements there, things for television, things for film. If you do like the animation elements but you don't want to get into TV animation, you can also do things like motion graphics or motion designer as well. On the other flip side, there's also things like agency work. So if you really want to get creative, you want to get into that more like big brands, but you don't really want to worry about like the technical side of stuff. There's a lot of digital agencies here in Vancouver and across Canada that deal with this too. So you could be working on television commercials, website stuff, a lot of website design as well. You could be doing short spots. You could be doing stuff for games, for TV, for mobile, for wearables. There's a lot of different things. And then, like I said, there's also medical, there's banking and financing as well. A lot of them need that kind of thing. So I don't want to say the possibilities are endless, but they are big and there's a lot of there. So if you have patience, you look around and you dedicate yourself, you can definitely most likely find something.
Nice. That's just really assuring for people who are going to get in. And because of the many different facets that I guess the UX industry has, we would like to know a typical day in the life of this position, but because there's a lot, what about your day-to-day life? Like what are the normal tasks that you do every day? We would like to know that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll give you a good example. It's not my current day-to-day because right now it's a little bit of a special edge case. I don't really want to use that as an example, but I will tell you from my previous job, working in medical software for a company called Cycle. That's where I used to work. My day-to-day there was, so I was a part of a design team. There was one lead designer, I was another designer, and I had a fellow colleague as well. So basically 2 regular designers and then a sort of a manager level somebody. Typically we start our day off like this company already had a product in the market. So they already had something that was available. People were already purchasing it. The company was already making money. It's been in business for over 20 years. So our jobs are basically to come in and work on refining this product. So we'd be given tasks by our lead that would assign it to us and say, okay, I've spoken with other team members within the tech team. And I mean, not to get into it too deep at the moment, but there's other people that deal with basically writing up scenarios of like, we want to come up with a new feature for this website or this product, right? We want people to be able to do XYZ thing. Here's how we think they should do it. Okay, UX team, now come up with a solution based on this. So to be given this information, we have some variables around, what it can do, what we think we want it to do, how long it might be, blah, 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 blah. We have all these things. And basically our process is to then sit down and kind of come up with a solution in a design sense. And the first thing we typically do is we do a little bit of research and referencing. So we look around for something that's similar, something that's already been done, something that kind of feels like it's close to that. If nothing exists in the market or out in the public space, we then often will sit down and say, okay, what can we come up with based on that? Knowing what our product does and knowing our audience, what do we think we want them to do? We would actually typically start with drawing like scribbles, kind of like, I don't want to say like doodles, but they're basically like very quick sketches that we do digitally. Our team either will work together, so 3 designers going away and saying, okay, we're going to spend an hour, do our thing, come together, and then kind of share our thoughts and see who's got the best version of something, or we might kind of Frankenstein it together and say, okay, this person's got this idea that we really like, but we really like this too. Let's just merge them all and have this really great final idea. Typically, we would do that in a day. We also talk to a lot of our technical colleagues, so programmers and developers who actually take the designs that we do and then implement them and actually have them show up in whatever online. If it's a web app or whatever that we're doing, it would show up. And so we work very closely with them, making sure that they translate our designs the way we want them to actually work. So it's not just visual, it's also the interaction. Like, if I click on something, what happens if I open this thing? How does that look? how long does it take, what it looks like in this situation or this situation. So we have a lot of edge cases that we have to think through, and we typically try to design all those out and give them to the developers so that they also know what to design for as well. And basically, it's almost like an assembly line if you kind of think about it in a sense, but the idea is that you're always trying to help the next person down the road. So it's not about making my job super easy. It's making the next person's job easy, but also fulfilling the needs that I need as well. So yeah, typically day in the life of a designer is you do a lot of work on your own, but you also deal with a lot of different people depending on our needs. Sometimes we have a lot of meetings to discuss ideas. We talk to product team, developer team, sometimes legal, marketing. Sometimes we don't talk to anybody and we just, talk amongst ourselves and we do our own design work, and it's kind of a heads down day. And other days it's more meeting heavy and we need to brainstorming, get ideas out there. So each place is different. I can't give you a one scenario that's going to fit everything, but in most situations, that's kind of how it works. And once you fall into a cadence, you really do understand where you're getting into, and nothing really feels out of the ordinary, unless you're in a startup, which in that case is a completely different ballgame because every day could be completely different. But in an established company, you're looking at some different stuff for sure.
Okay, and I don't know if we could, because you said that it's gonna vary from company to company, but let's stick with the example that you have in your, as you say, in your previous job. Would you say that that is more project based or process based? Because trying to figure it out, you're bouncing from project to process. So I would like to know what you think of it.
Yeah, so in that previous setting, it was definitely around project. We had one solid core offering that we did, which in itself is basically broken up into multiple sections. So if you think about it, like it was a medical application, so we did calendaring and scheduling for people. We did image recording, and we did invoicing, payment services. We did all this kind of stuff. These are all different sections within the platform, and we didn't have to all work on them at the same time. So very much, I would say it is a product driven thing that has a lot of processes behind it. We had our sort of cadences around what we're going to do. We have our meetings that we have daily with the teams to check in with everybody. How's the work coming along? Does anyone have any problems? Does anyone need anything from anybody? Questions to be answered, that kind of thing. And then the rest of it is basically around that, is a lot about just following through and finishing things. We all have deadlines and timelines. They all kind of vary a little bit, but yeah, more or less that's kind of how it would be.
Okay, that's good to know. Very insightful. And with that, what qualities or characteristics do you think that make people best suited for this career path? What do you think?
So I talked about it a little bit before, but I would say definitely being curious, being hungry, wanting to figure out how things work from not just like a design side, but really just kind of understanding like this different mindset of like, how is somebody going to do this? What do we want them to do? The one thing I can definitely recommend if you're looking for success, you really want to get out there and be the best you can be. I would say it's really good if you don't have to, but it's nice to have some psychology background a little bit. So pick up a few psychology books, learn a little bit about human interaction and human behavioral patterns, like how people think, because there are things that we do that are very instinctual, especially with technology, that will play a big factor. And the more you know about that, the better you can anticipate people's needs and wants without even having to really ask them. Another side of it, I think that's really underutilized, is the business element. So actually understanding how businesses work and how financing works, because a lot of companies, especially startups, are struggling, right? Their whole facet is they want to try to get enough money to keep the lights on. They want to keep going. But the other thing is, as a UX designer, you're not limited just to your own space. So a lot of the time, your value is actually very high to the company. You're not just designing a product and making it look pretty. You're actually designing how people look at a product, how they feel about it, and if they come back. So you are actually the moneymaker for the company in a lot of sense, because if people hate the product because it doesn't feel good or it's not intuitive, they're not going to use it. So it doesn't matter if it's engineered the best in the world, it's got the best code, it's super fast, doesn't matter. If it doesn't feel good, it's not intuitive, it's clunky, it's whatever, no one's going to use it. So our jobs as designers are actually quite important. And a lot of the times the businesses don't realize that, or they kind of underplay it. So it's also our job to kind of reaffirm that to them and say, no, we do provide a lot of value. We are actually very important, and our seat at the table should be quite high. So another thing I think to actually know is a little bit of business acronym, actually understanding how businesses work, but also understanding how that business works. Now, if you're working for like an Amazon or Microsoft, you probably don't need to worry about that. But a lot of mid-sized companies, are open to that idea. And especially if you're in an environment that's positive and seems to be open to that kind of thing, I think you can make a great contribution to the company, and your value will really be shown, because I've done this in my career. And even if it's things like marketing or graphics or other elements where I could help out, the company was grateful for it. And that also makes a really good bond with you, really promotes how well you can be, and really just helps you in your own career path for the next job or wherever you might end up.
Okay, that's good to know. At least there is something trainable since you brought it up. So I would like to recap it. It's business knowledge and good use of psychology because of the empathy part. Okay,
Mhm.
gotcha. Uh, Now, how has the industry changed during your years of experience?
Yeah, so like I said, I pretty much started, I want to say in like 2011, which is, I'm dating myself now. It's quite a while ago, but it's changed quite a bit, because at the time when I started, mobile phones were just becoming a thing. Like we were what, iPhone 4 at the time, Android, whatever. We had like Nexus devices and Samsung, whatever. Like, all these things were still really, really new, and the idea of having them be ubiquitous with everyday life wasn't quite there yet. So the technologies weren't matured. We didn't have things like Unity and Unreal Engine the same way we do now. So the graphical components weren't there. The idea of machine learning and AI and VR, like this stuff was way far away. So for us, it was just simple experiences of like trying to make things just work. So everything looked kind of clunky. It obviously had that sort of skeuomorphic design that was really popular back then, a lot of glassy, glossy kind of looking buttons and stuff like that. But then that changed over time. Even the game industry's changed. Software as a service kind of changed a little bit more. The idea of reoccurring revenue became more and more popular. People became more comfortable with paying things online. Having subscriptions became much more of a normal thing. I think Netflix normalized this a lot. The idea of things like Uber and Lyft became more normal. So those kind of concepts became much more ingrained in everyday culture. So I think that way technology changed as well. And the idea that we just need better data, because if you want to have a product or an offering that does something for you, you actually need a lot of input from a person. So we need to collect data in a certain way. So things like, wearables and heart rate monitoring and sleep tracking and all this stuff, those helped a lot of things as well. So the industry has really shifted into this as well. It's also shifted much more into everyone's expanding into different services as well. People are realizing that they might have a core offering, and then from that you can kind of extrapolate out. You can really see this very clearly in what Apple's doing now with their strategy. It's no longer about the hardware as much as about the hardware and the software as services integration. So it's like, yeah, you can buy an iPad, but it's also about, oh, you can do, fitness, and then you have like your iCloud stuff and arcade, and you have this and you have that, and all those things tie together. That will only keep going as well. And of course, everyone's getting into the VR. We've heard a lot about NFTs and all this kind of stuff, blockchain, all this new technical stuff is coming up, Web3, all these things are there. These didn't really exist back then. The advent of Web 2 was just starting at the time. So a lot of these things have become now standardized. People are now accustomed to this. So now the user, the general average user, is much more familiar with things than they were a decade ago, where some of those concepts were very new and very niche. It has now become a lot more, normalized as well. So I think technology has definitely increased. It's become faster, smoother. There's a lot more it can do, but also people themselves have just become much better at it. Everywhere from kids to elderly folks have just gotten much, much, much more in depth with it.
Right, and you could say that because we gotten more like when we go to VR and NFTs and all, you could say UX is more prominent and much more needed compared to last time, because last time we're just trying to get the best tech, but then now the user experience in this case is needed, because it's like, oh, this don't feel right, just leave.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. Okay, well, thank you so much for answering my questions. Now, I would like to open up the floor, and feel free to raise your hand or drop your questions in the chat, if anyone wants to.
I do have a question for Daniel. I know you've been talking a lot about UX and UI. Can you tell us a little bit, like, what are the differences between those two?
Good question. Good question. Yes, I didn't elaborate on this. I'll give you an analogy. Actually, that's probably the easiest way of explaining the differences between the two. So I like to use this example when I was teaching in the past as well. Is basically UX is kind of like, you can think about it like when you drive a car, right? You get into a car, you sit down, you start to drive. It's the feeling of the car, right? It's the tires, it's the brakes, how responsive they are, how quick they are. It's the steering wheel. It's, you know, how you change the gears, how smooth that works. It's where the positionings are for all those things. It's the AC. It's all that kind of stuff. The UI element of it is basically your dashboard, right? You're looking at your speedometer, your fuel gauge, your, you know, oil, whatever. It's all the small visceral stuff like that, but they work together. It's not independent of each other. They work in unison, and together they provide a service to the user, which is basically the person whoever's driving the car. So that's the best way I can say it for somebody who might not be familiar with it at all, because really it's both things. And it's not that one is more important than the other. They go hand in hand. They do very different things, but at the same time, it's all about that experience both ways. It's visual experience, but it's also sort of an emotional, and it's also something you don't really think about. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about, because when something goes right, it's an expectation, right? You expect it to be that way. It's only when something goes wrong do you notice that something's not right. And then you start to really think about, well, why did that happen? Oh, this should be like this. And then, you know, you start to think about it this way.
Oh, so you could say like UI is like the eye candy, and then UX is how you feel about it, and it goes hand in hand. Now that's actually really a really, I mean, not say surprising. I would think it is, because um because you could definitely you can definitely separate them, but if you say that they can work in tandem, that's actually really that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a follow-up question of what you said, because you talked about how um, it's all about the user experience. And I was just wondering, how do you measure these things? Like, how important is research in like UX design or even UI?
Oh, it's tremendously important. So, like I mentioned in the beginning, when Adam asked the question, like, you know, what's the typical day starting like? I mentioned like research and reference, and I didn't allude to too much of it, but basically, that's a lot of that focuses on that element of researching, like, number one, understanding who the user actually is. So, you know, sometimes if you work for a company, you're lucky and you know exactly who your audience is, your customers. You can say, okay, we know that our customers are these people, and they can be broken down into, you know, age categories, geographical locations, job positions, titles, whatever. It can be you know, anonymous, or it could actually be, you know, you actually know who they are because you have a first party connection with them, to your company or the product offering. But most times, yeah, you really want to look into it, and depending on the needs of the design, you have to basically, you ask questions, or you set up seminars and sessions, and you say, you know, I really want to kind of interview this person and ask them, hey, how to use this tool, or how to use this software? What are the things you're looking for? What is your typical workflow look like? What are the things that you are needing to do? What are the things you do often? What are the things you don't like doing? And really, you're almost like kind of like a cop. You're kind of like interviewing them and being like, tell me things about how you do stuff, so you can really understand what their mindset is. So then that way you can kind of gauge and say, okay, we know from talking to X amount of people that they do it this way. If we change that, what are the pros and cons this other way? Now, there's other tools out there, obviously. I'm just talking about the actual interview and sort of research sections, but the actual quantifiable data can come back from a lot of different sources. That can be digital, where you get sort of browser data back, for example, from things like Chrome or Safari, and you can kind of look at elements there and say, okay, this person's, you know, been in on this page for X amount of time and then they left. Why did they leave? Or, you know, this one page has a lot of people leaving really quickly. They come in and they leave in 3 seconds. Well, why is that? And then you can kind of, you know, internalize it and say, well, maybe it's this thing. And sometimes you don't know, right? It's really hard to gauge. So this is where we do things like A/B testing, where we'll try 2 different versions of the same thing and say, hey, we'll try version A for 2 weeks, and we'll try version B for 2 weeks and see how people react. And sometimes you don't say anything, and you'll just let people sort of be guinea pigs, and you'll just see how they behave with it. And then you see from the numbers, oh, this one's doing better, so therefore our predictions were correct. You see this actually in big companies too. Facebook's actually very guilty of doing this all the time, where they'll change the platform quite often, add in features without telling you. Sometimes some people have it, other people don't. Different regions. Canada, for example, is a good user testing area because our population is at an actual optimal size. We're about under 40 million people. So they don't do it in the US because they're, 350 million to 400 million people. But Australia, Canada, and parts of the UK, we're a great testing site. So big companies will often run these kind of experiments and to see how people react to stuff or a new product offering or something like that.
Okay. And yeah, one small question. When you're talking about research and all, I'm curious. So is it your job to like do the research, or is it another group of people in another department that is in charge of the research?
Yeah, that's a good point too. It depends on the company. I think it's a great skill to have, and I think every UX designer should have some resemblance of having research skills, like be able to interview people, take notes at least, or just be able to ask questions and facilitate. I think that's really good to know. There is an actual job that's specifically called a UX researcher. That's all they do. They don't touch the designs, they don't touch the UI. All they do is specifically set up seminars and sessions. They record information, write down notes. That's their whole job. It's very heavy on again, very heavy in the writing, very heavy in psychology, a lot of those elements. It's a tricky job to get, but for those who are really wanting to do it, it is very much sought after. And there are entire teams of people that do that. Again, if we're talking about big companies, your Googles and your Facebooks and stuff, yes, they have entire divisions of people that do that. But smaller companies, mid-sized companies, often the budgeting and the scheduling doesn't allow for something like that. So often that research and sort of figuring things out falls to the UX designer, where they have to kind of take up that job a little bit more. But depending on how many people you have in your team, you can always sort of designate it to somebody, or you can split the tasks, or you can do it, collaboratively. It doesn't have to be just one designer. Sometimes we do, all three of us would sit down and we would all sort of not really pepper the person, but we'd all ask them questions generally, and we all have different things to ask. So, somebody would have an idea of, oh, well, this came to my mind. What about this? And then they would ask the question, somebody would write notes and so on. So yeah, it's a very fluid thing. It's not like a hard set thing, I think.
Okay, all right. That's good to know. So final call for any last minute questions from the audience. If not, I would like to say thank you so much, Daniel. So do you actually have any final words or advice or thoughts to share?
Yeah, I would say if anyone's like actually legitimately interested in doing UX, there's a lot of great resources online. That's the other thing that's changed over the last 10 to 11 years is like, honestly, there's a lot more resources out there now than when I started. There's actual dedicated tools now for this. So, when I started, we used Photoshop and Illustrator. And now you have Sketch and Figma and Adobe XD and all these different programs. Back then, we just had to do whatever we had, and we had to like work with these sort of archaic tools. But now you have a lot more. So I think there's a lot of awesome resources available online and just around as well. Of course, the school and this program is another great entry point. But if you're looking just to dip your toes in a little bit, I would definitely recommend looking around. Don't worry too much about the technical aspects of learning like programming and code. Learn more about, a little bit about the design, learn about topography, layouts, structures, information architecture, these elements first, the foundations, learn those really well. And then everything from there you can extrapolate. You can always learn more art styling later. That's not that important. But if you know your foundations, you can apply that anywhere and you can apply it quick. And that would be the biggest thing really to help propel you to the next thing. There's a lot of mobile stuff, there's web stuff, there's, whatever you're into, there's always something there. But I would say it all kind of connects together. So just because you think, well, I like this one thing, it doesn't really matter or work, there's always a way you can kind of tie it in. Even storytelling, filmmaking, writing, being able to write good copy, that's important. Being able to articulate your ideas, and also just being not afraid of rejection, because that's another thing you have to do as a designer is you're going to put your designs out there in front of a team of people. People are going to not always be nice about it, and sometimes they're going to rip it apart. You have to be okay with just letting go and saying, "Yep, I did my best. Somebody didn't like it. All right, back to the drawing board. That's my job." So, and these things you learn over time, they just grow on you. But for now, I'd say that's probably the best advice I can give.
All right, that's what a way to wrap this whole thing up, actually. Thank you. And yeah, so thank you so much for like taking the time to join me today. This has been very insightful, and I'm grateful to have taken the opportunity to have a conversation with someone so experienced with hands-on knowledge. And I think new students will be quite lucky to have you as their teacher. To find
Thank you.
out
Yeah.
to find out more information, you can find all of the links in the description, or check out our website to read all about our program information or learn about the registration process. Thank you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.